Thanks everyone for today. Everyone I've met today, such a wonderful, warm welcome I've had since coming here. Feel very privileged to be the first person in your room as well. So thank you for that. Okay, so today, yeah, as Zach was saying, I want to talk to you a little bit about some of the research that I've been doing, mainly in my postdoc and also more recently as an assistant professor. I realize I'm talking to mainly a room of marine scientists, so I'm going to take a bit of a high overview on some of the ways in which the atmosphere and the ocean are coupled through aerosol transport, through aerosol deposition, having a look at some of the kind of challenges that I've faced in the science, some of the ways that we've addressed some of those challenges, and then later on some of the challenges which still remain. This idea of the idea that aerosols can couple marine biogeochemical cycles, and through that, we can understand something about the way that the Earth system works, and then how human activities may be perturbing those systems. Okay, so I just want to start then with a nice little easy schematic for everybody of the kind of work that I think about in terms of the research and what we're going to cover today. So here we have a cycle, a marine biogeochemical cycle, and climate. Okay. So here where I start on this cycle, it goes all the way around, but where I would start is I would start to think about things like nutrient aerosols. So the emissions of aerosol to the atmosphere from the land, or indeed from the ocean themselves. They can then get transported through the atmosphere, and then when they land back onto the ocean, they can potentially cause ecosystem changes, fertility, changes in net primary productivity. Here we're going to be paying attention today just in terms of the marine ecosystems, but you can also get aerosols potentially fertilizing land ecosystems as well. Now, if you have increases in primary productivity, there is potential for CO2 sequestration, potential for CO2 drawdown through the biological pump as well. Story doesn't end there, of course. It isn't just here from nutrient aerosol delivery through to a change in the carbon cycle. You can also have, if you increase productivity, you can have increases of biological emissions back up to the atmosphere. This can cycle then round, causing changes in climate, air temperature, cloud properties, precipitation. That can change those land processes, which were in fact then cycling back to our nutrient aerosol. For today's talk, we're going to do aerosols in terms of their emissions. We're going to do transport. We'll have a little look at some of the potential for aerosol to fertilize marine ecosystems. And then we're going to finish here with a little bit about carbon sequestration and how some of these things are changing. I will not be talking about the rest of this cycle in today's talk. Okay, so let's start off with aerosol emissions. So this is a lovely schematic from NASA. I absolutely love showing this animation. What we're looking at here is all of the different types of aerosol being emitted to the atmosphere and how they're transporting through the atmosphere. Okay, so in orange here, we have dust coming out of North Africa being transported across North Atlantic here. In the red, we're looking at fire signals. Okay, so we've got some fire from South Africa. We've got here, we've got lots of fires in Brazil, as well as coming down into Southern America. Here, we're looking at a fire, which was a very famous fire. This is the 2019-2020 mega fire, which actually consumed about 21% of the forests of Australia. So really, when we talk about extreme events, I have a bit of a love-hate relationship with that word extreme. What does extreme really mean? But this truly is catastrophic. It was truly extreme. If you keep watching here, you'll see how that plume evolved and was pushing lots and lots of aerosol out over to the South Pacific, and we'll come back to that later in today's talk. In the pink up here in China and also East Asia, America and Europe, we're looking at anthropogenic aerosols, and then in blue, these lovely swirly cycling here, that's our sea salt. But the first thing that you should realize as you're kind of watching this is those aerosol types that I've just kind of gone through, they all have distinct temporal resolutions. Okay, so what I'm saying here is that they are not spatially homogeneous. They're very heterogeneous in terms of their spatial distribution. So aerosols last in the atmosphere for just a couple of days, maybe up to about a week or two at most. So their impacts are regional or local, not like greenhouse gases or long-lived gases, okay, which are well mixed in the atmosphere, okay. The impact of aerosols is regional, so therefore understanding the source regions, we can start it again, maybe. So understanding differences in the source regions what's downwind of those source regions and the properties of those aerosols from different sources is therefore really important in understanding the impacts that they may be having on biogeochemical cycles. Okay, so just what, in terms of aerosol nutrients, is coming out of what different sources? What might we be interested in if we were looking at different nutrient types, depending on those differences in the sources? So here we're looking at a ternary diagram. In orange, you have a dust source. In red, you're looking at pyrogenic sources, so things formed by combustion. That can either be through human combustion activities or fire on the land. And then in blue, we're looking at all of these kind of sum of all of the different other natural sources. This is the fractional contribution in this ternary diagram of these sources to these different nutrient types, okay? So in N, we've got nitrogen, P for phosphorus, Fe for iron, total and soluble components. And what you can see clearly is that the total part, the mineral of iron and the total phosphorus, that mineral fraction, is really dominated, okay, by that dust source. Okay, dust is producing, in terms of the global emissions, it's dominating the source of iron and phosphorus to the atmosphere. However, in terms of what we're interested in terms of the impacts of aerosol on biogeochemical cycles, on primary productivity, on phytoplankton, what we are actually interested in is this soluble fraction. Okay, we believe that that's the fraction of the aerosol which is most likely to be used by the phytoplankton. So in here, what you can see is once you start characterizing that soluble fraction, once you're interested in that, then the other sources all become equally important. Okay, so we have this idea that was researched for a very, very long time that dust was the main source of these nutrients, that we should really be caring about dust. But that story has been changing over the last couple of years, and we're starting to appreciate that all of these other sources are also likely to be major contributors to iron and soluble phosphorus in different places around the world. If you're interested in nitrogen, it's a very, very different signal. Nitrogen is dominated by anthropogenic emissions. Okay, really, that is the major source, is combustion. In terms of the nitrogen signal. So for our minerals, total amount, sure, yep, care about dust, but if you're interested in that kind of soluble fraction, these other sources all become into play. And for nitrogen, you're interested in anthropogenic. Now, if I just kind of said that, you might then think that that these things are actually working independently of each other. But the beauty of the Earth system, of course, anybody who studies the Earth system and how it's coupled, is you soon come to realize that all cycles, all things are interconnected. Okay, these things don't really exist in isolation to one another. These things are in fact working together in many different ways. A nice example of that is in that last ternary diagram I was talking about, dust and fire as if they were separate. But actually, if we consider what's actually happening in a fire, we'll soon see that these things are actually coupled. So I'm showing here is a schematic of a fire from a couple of seconds. So we're talking about the initiation of the fire through to minutes, hours, days, months. The fire has gone out now through to years until the biome has recovered. Okay, so we're looking at a temporal evolution of a fire. Here in the schematic, we have a nice plume coming out of our fire. And we've got two arrows on here. The red arrow is depicting for us the main kind of uplift of this plume due to pyroconvection. The heat of that fire is creating uplift, but that's also then at the same time it's creating smaller eddies. And what they're doing is they're actually entraining dust. They're entraining the local soils. So when we're thinking about a fire, quite often you might think it's just the vegetation of a tree. Vegetation is burning, you know, some grasses may be burning. But it's not true. If you're thinking about it from a more holistic point of view, you're actually getting both of these things together in your smoke plume. You're getting the combusted material, your vegetation, and you're also getting entrainment of the soils as well. So in this way, our dust and fire cycles are actually coupled. So within that plume, we can measure our nitrogen, our iron, and our phosphorus. But the story doesn't end there. Okay, so we have these two different sources in our fire in terms of these nutrients. But here, once you've removed this once you've removed this tree and these grasses, you've created a bare, erodible soil landscape now. What's going to happen? Well, when the winds come across that landscape, you're now going to get dust being able to be emitted from a surface where it couldn't be emitted from before. So now there's a legacy impact of a fire. Okay, so you might be thinking again, okay, I've got a fire. This is what the plume is that I'm like paying attention to. But actually, if you want to integrate, you have to think about the time until the actual ecosystem recovers. and there's this big dust plume that comes out from many, after many large fires. And that becomes important later. Keep this in mind when we come to some of the other ecological biogeochemical impacts. Currently, we think that it's probably about 50%. 1 in 2 large fires are followed by this increased dust emission. Okay, so that's pretty much like a lot, a lot of the dust. And then the question then that you might be asking then is back to this first one. Okay, if you know that there's 2 sources, you have a combustion of your tree and you have this soil which is being entrained, which is more important in terms of supplying iron or other elements to the atmosphere. Here, I'm just going to pay attention to iron. So what we did is we had a look at 16 different aircraft campaigns, which had measured smoke across different biomes around the world. Here we have Africa, we have South America, we have Europe, all sorts of different biomes. Compared the iron concentration in those plumes to the aluminium concentration, okay, to create a ratio. And what we found on average around the world is that that ratio is about 0.6 to 1, okay? And then what you can do is you can create an enrichment factor from there. So if the soils have a 0.44 to 1 ratio, then that must mean that this is enriched compared to the soils. And if the soils are being entrained, then this difference gives you how much iron is coming from the consumption of that biomass versus how much is being entrained. So then you work out that about 1/3 in a fire, 1/3 of the iron is actually coming from the combustion of the material itself, while the actual dominant part, the vast majority of the mass, is in fact actually being entrained from the soils itself. So they're going to have very different characteristics in terms of the iron. And that's important for when we're then thinking again about these kind of biogeochemical impacts. Okay, so that's emissions. Okay, so emissions, once things are emitted into the atmosphere, we've just seen how they're transported through the atmosphere. And then what we're going to be interested in is how do they get back to the ocean? Okay, and that can occur through 2 different processes. It can occur through dry deposition and it can occur through wet deposition in terms of the atmosphere. Wet deposition is the loss of aerosol or the nutrients contained within that aerosol within precipitation, whereas our dry deposition is the impaction of that aerosol with the surface. Dry deposition is also a function of aerosol size. Larger particles, coarser particles, things like dust particles, which are larger, they're going to have a higher gravitational settling velocity than smaller particles. Okay, wet deposition is obviously going to be a function of where you're having clouds, where you're actually having precipitation occur. And so you end up with maps like this. So this is a modeling representation of the fraction of the total nutrient deposition for both nitrogen, phosphorus, and soluble iron, which is being deposited by dry deposition. If you're watching carefully in that animation, or if you know where the deserts and the way that dust moves around the world actually is, you'll see quite clearly that, in fact, the highest fractions of dry deposition are correlated with dust plumes. That should be no surprise for 2 things. One, as I've just said, dust is big, it's large, those particles are larger, so they've got a larger dry deposition velocity, but also they're coming from a dry, arid region, okay? So high amounts of dry deposition from dust in these dust plumes, much more wet deposition as you get away from the plumes. And then that matters when we're thinking in terms of the magnitude of the pulse of that deposition. Okay, so a wet deposition event, a precipitation event, is basically dumping everything out of the atmosphere in one go, whereas a dry deposition is much more of a slower kind of process in terms of supplying that aerosol back to the ocean surface. Okay, so that's a little bit on emissions, a little bit on deposition. Let's get to an interesting figure now about what's ending up where in terms of these sources, in terms of their deposition. This plot just takes a second to get your head around, but once you have, I think it's a really nice plot. So you have the soluble deposition flux, okay, mass per meter squared per day. And that's integrated over each of these 4 different regions. Okay, so region 1 is basically this really high dust region, dust-dominated region. Region 2 is the North Indian Ocean. Region 3 is the vast majority of the North Pacific, with a little bit around South East Asia here as well. And then region 4 is our Southern Hemisphere ocean. And then we can have a look at the dust deposition by month. And this is a 35 years worth of simulation of dust deposition from 3 different sources in terms of iron from dust, sorry, not dust deposition, in terms of iron deposition, in terms of the iron and dust, fire, and anthropogenic. So 3 different sources, orange, red, and blue. The purple is the combination of these 2 together. And for each month of the year, you have 2 things on the plot. You have this line, that's the 35-year trend for that month. Okay, so if you start here, for example, that's the amount that was being deposited, which is about 1 microgram per meter squared per cubed in January. And if you go to here, by the end in 2015, in 1980 to 2015, it's doubled. Okay, so that's what that's showing you, the difference, the trend, and then the boxes are showing you the overall mean across all different sources. What we can see is that you can actually divide the world quite nicely, actually, into 4 different regions. So here, unsurprisingly, downwind of the North African deserts, the vast majority of iron, sorry, is coming from dust with little seasonality. It does have some seasonality to it, but actually there's a plentiful supply of dust integrated across this whole region. So if you're interested in understanding how aerosol might be impacting ocean biogeochemical cycles here, then of course you're going to be caring about the dust. Similar story here, okay, when you move over to the Indian Ocean, but this time we're looking at a really strong seasonality in terms of our dust and our dust deposition, really highly peaking in the summertime. And there's potentially also been a change over time here as well, with increasing dust amount being deposited in more recent years compared to earlier decades. Now, as we move across to Asia and we have a look at the Pacific, then the story starts to change. Yes, there is a nice seasonality in terms of that dust, in terms of what's being deposited to the ocean, in terms of the iron. But imposed upon that, we have this really strong increasing trend in anthropogenic deposition. So from 1980 to 2015, as Asia's been industrializing much, much quicker, we're getting a really, really large source of anthropogenic. And actually, in some months outside of the dust season, actually the pyrogenic signal, when you add fire into it as well, is actually now exceeding the amount of dust. So dust is no longer the number 1 player here in more recent years. We're actually seeing this anthropogenic signal starting to take over. And that's probably only going to increase, even with future pollution controls on fossil fuels. Our demand for metals, metal smelting, steel, and all of these kinds of things, all the rare elements that you're using in your laptops and phones, our demand for that is not going away, I'm afraid. So even with the reduction of fossil fuels, this trend probably will increase into the future. And then if we look at the Southern Ocean, really important in terms of our carbon CO2 drawdown, productivity, probably a lot of people's favorites if you're interested in biogeochemical cycles. You can see here that that there's a nice seasonality to both the dust and the fire, although that seasonality is more pronounced for fire. So you end up with a peak around about September, where both are equally contributing in terms of the source, in terms of that flux of the iron to the Southern Ocean. But the seasonality in fires is much, 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 much stronger. That's also changing under climate change as well. You're just getting an increase here. You can see in the fire signal, a little bit of a decrease in recent years too. So in the Southern Ocean, again, you've got this similar story that other sources are playing major roles. Now, for all the students in the room, where's the HNLC regions? Okay, you'll see HNLC regions, HNLC regions, and HNLC regions. So depending on what one you're looking at, if you're interested in Equatorial Pacific, sure, let's pay attention to the dust. If you're interested in North Pacific, well, you're going to have to start paying attention to anthropogenic sources. And if you're down in the Southern Ocean, you should absolutely be paying attention to what the fires are doing and their changes there. Okay. My first takeaway for you, unsurprisingly, is complicated. There's a large array of processes acting across the land to ocean continuum, shown here in this top part of this nice, pretty schematic here for you. Okay. This is a real top overview for you. I'm happy to dig into anything later that you might want to ask about those processes. But different places, basically the takeaway, different places are being affected by different aerosol sources at different times. The seasonality, and there's also an anthropogenic already. We're already beginning to see an anthropogenic signal on there. Okay. Second part. Okay, so why should we care? Do we care about this? Okay, so I've just shown you that aerosol can be deposited at different times, at different magnitudes, at different ocean basins. So what? Right? Is it having an impact? Should we care about it? So this is a compilation study that I did a couple of years ago with Cecile Gouy. And what we did is we collected all of the bioassay information that we could possibly find in the literature to find out, if we looked across all of these different studies, if there was any particular signal that we could find, tease out what you're looking at. And so anybody who doesn't know what a bioassay is, basically you go out on the ocean, you grab a bucket of your water, okay, or whatever, you're getting some seawater with some chlorophyll in it. You do some artificial aerosol addition, and that aerosol addition can either be, depending on the study, they either use mineral dust, they either use some anthropogenic ash, so they got some ash from somewhere. And a couple of studies, 2 studies actually grab some volcanic ash as well. Then they measure the chlorophyll, so they measure the chlorophyll at the time of the aerosol addition, then they keep on measuring chlorophyll for some amount of time. And what I'm showing you here is the maximum increase in chlorophyll. There's a relative percentage to a starting point, okay, from that aerosol addition in each of these different studies. So the larger the circle, okay, the larger the percentage aerosol, larger percentage increase in chlorophyll due to that addition of the aerosol. What you can see is that in general, if we look even just across the globe, Mediterranean, East Asia, whatever you want to look at, that you can see that there's a lot of blue. Okay, so that means that in general, across the 70 different studies that we found, there is in fact an increase in chlorophyll upon aerosol addition of about 80%. Okay, chlorophyll increased by 80% after artificial aerosol addition in all of these different bioassays. However, you'll also see there's lots of crosses. Okay, crosses means that nothing happened at all. Okay, so you added some aerosol from your source and you didn't see any change at all in your chlorophyll. And there's actually some pink, and pink is where there was a decrease. So we added some aerosol and then there was a decrease in the chlorophyll being measured. There's many different reasons for that. In terms of negative, the 18 received no negative, no response. Sorry, 10 negative to 18 no response. Different reasons in different places. Potentially, in fact, that your aerosol that you added just didn't supply the nutrient that the biota wanted in there. Maybe potentially that the metabolic balance was reinforcing heterotrophs, or in some cases there's a toxic impact. Okay, things like copper. If you get too much copper being brought in, copper in small amounts is good. Copper in really, really large amounts really bad. Dust contains quite a lot of copper, for example, and some anthropogenic sources also contain quite a lot of copper. So they can induce a toxic effect. The nice thing about doing something like this then is that you can then have a look at what the average might be for different sources. Okay, so this was all of our sources together. Okay, aerosol is having some sort of impact. But if we look down here, we can separate it out by our 3 different sources. We can see on general that mineral dust has about a 70% increase, whereas our anthropogenic source was about 50% more, above 100% increase. So that's suggesting that anthropogenic aerosol addition is having a larger impact on chlorophyll. There's something about the properties of anthropogenically sourced iron compared to mineral dust iron, which is enhancing our bioavailability potentially of the iron. And as we saw earlier, it is more soluble as a source, but we're definitely seeing that it has a larger impact. I'm a wildfire scientist at heart. There is no wildfire data yet. There actually may be one from the Thomas fire here. Anybody who's interested in doing bioassays, anyone who loves doing bioassays, please go and do a fire one. Okay, get some fire ash and put some numbers onto this plot. I think it would be very nice to see how fire compares to some of these results. But that doesn't mean that there isn't evidence, in fact, of fire also having an impact. So bioassays are great, okay? So they're giving you like a small snapshot. It's a controlled environment, but it's not representative, of course, of the full ocean. It's not coupling all of the different processes within the ocean. It's not taking account of changes in the physical, chemical, biological state of the ocean, or these kinds of like larger scale processes. But what we can do is we can use satellites to have a look into what 2 studies I want to introduce you to, which have shown how fire could potentially be impacting phytoplankton growth in 2 different parts of the world, and as observed mainly from satellites, and with a little bit of modeling in here too. First, I'm going to take you to the Arctic, and then I'm going to take you to the Southern Ocean. Okay, for the Arctic. Yeah, go for it. Yeah. You're falling asleep. for me to do a dance or something. Keep everyone awake. Okay, so take you to the Arctic Ocean first. So the Arctic Ocean, first thing you need to know about the Arctic Ocean, if you don't know, it's nitrogen limited. Okay, it's wanting nitrogen. So this is one of those kind of fun stories. Some colleagues at Stanford, oceanographers, they observed this really, really large chlorophyll phytoplankton bloom up in the Laptev Sea. This is Russia here. Okay, this is sea ice here. They found a really, really, really large phytoplankton bloom, and they started to try to work out what on earth could have caused it. Looked at all of the ocean variables that they could think of: river runoff, internal recycling, uplift, or upwelling. They couldn't find anything at all. Okay, so they're like, well, if there's nothing within the ocean, maybe it was the atmosphere. So they came to me and they were like, hey, we've got this interesting like problem here. Do you want to have like a little look at it? And I'm like, yeah, great. Like, I love this kind of like kind of idea of what could it possibly be? So my first thought was, well, you are just north of the boreal forest. Let's have a little look to see if there was a particularly large fire in 2014, in the summer of 2014. And it turns out there was. Okay. So this is the nitrogen emission anomaly. Again, anomalies here are the summer of 2014, against the 21st century climatological mean. So we had a really, really large fire, and this is the excess amount of nitrogen compared to normal that was being emitted from this fire. So when you combust your trees, some of the nitrogen is being released. And we're like, okay, so there is a fire, but is that fire going to have any sort of impact on our phytoplankton bloom in Laptev Sea? So we had to look first of all at some back trajectories. Yep, okay, looks like it. The wind back trajectories were, in fact, there's some smoke here. If you squint, you can see it. And the back trajectories were suggesting that the transport pathways were correct. So then what we did is we then ran a model. So we ran a model with the fire. We calculated how much fire was being emitted from the forest fire, and then how much fire was then being deposited to the ocean. Again, we're looking at nitrogen deposition in terms of an anomaly here. This is the total nitrogen deposition. And for this particular summer, 2014, yes, there was an anomaly in nitrogen deposition compared to normal. And we think that the reason for that was this forest fire. So then the last thing to do is like, well, how much nitrogen was being deposited and how much nitrogen was needed to support that bloom? Okay, so large fire, large nitrogen deposition. And these are the numbers. So the nitrogen requirement was around about 3.5 millimoles of nitrogen. Our deposition, though, from our forest fire was at best maybe giving us like 30% of that, if we're really kind of pushing those uncertainties to the max. So that left us with a huge gap, right? So it's not the forests, maybe they're doing a little bit, okay? It wasn't anything in terms of internal, the oceanographers have scraped everything off. What else could it possibly be? And so if you know anything about the boreal region, you'll know that it's currently undergoing a thawing of the permafrost, okay? There's a lot of peat locked up in these soils. This is how much peat we have. This is a map of how much peat in the soils. Lots and lots and lots and lots of peat basically locked up in these soils. That's defrosting under climate change. And these peat fires that are then occurring are releasing that. So you've got millennia's worth of dead leaves, dead trees that's decomposed. Carbon, nitrogen, which has been stored up for a very long time, is now being released in these fires. And these were the fires of that year. We found that, in fact, some of those fires were actually in hotspots of the peat. So it wasn't just the forest that was burning, it was the peat as well. And then when we then calculate the peat contribution, we find out that we can actually close the budget here. So this, I think, is an interesting way we're thinking about climate change. The Arctic is warming at a rate which is faster than the rest of the world, okay? If we have increased warming, then we're going to have this permafrost defrosting. What happens when you suddenly release millennia's worth of nitrogen or carbon within a couple of decades or longer? What's going to happen to the biogeochemistry of the Arctic, which is nitrogen limited? I do not have an answer to that question. That is absolutely open and out there. But this is definitely one way in which we can think about the coupling of climate to biogeochemical cycles through that land-ocean atmosphere continuum being coupled by aerosols. Happy to talk to anyone about this who is interested in Arctic and Arctic dynamics. It's certainly something that I'd like to follow up on a little bit more. myself. Okay, let's take you now to the Southern Ocean. Let's take you to the other side of the world, and we're going to have a look at that 2019-2020 megafire that I just spoke about. This is a picture of it from the satellite here. So it was absolutely catastrophic. 21% of the forest was consumed. Down here, what you're looking at, here's Australia. Here's a plume, a smoke and dust plume here coming out. You can really see once again how pervasive that plume was. We'd already seen it, of course, earlier in the NASA animation. And so this study here, the Tang and Lort study, was really, really nice. What they did is they used then the satellites to have a look at the chlorophyll anomaly of this year against, I think it's about 20 years around it. And what they found was that, in fact, that yes, there was a phytoplankton bloom here, which is underneath this plume here. If you actually integrate the size of these plumes, you actually end up with the size of that bloom, which was bigger than Australia itself. So it's absolutely phenomenal, really, really huge phytoplankton bloom, which was observable from space, downwind of this fire where that smoke was being deposited. So what they did is they took that information and then they calculated the change in net primary productivity. Here you're looking at the climatological net primary productivity across this region here. Here you're looking at that fire season. Okay, this is an enhancement against the climatology. It's about 20%, about 20% more net primary productivity in this year than normal. Keep that 20% number in your mind as well for later. It's going to come back, okay? Then they did a very back of the envelope calculation to calculate the export production. Turns out to be the same number, 20% more carbon being exported at this time. Okay. And then, now I will say you should treat this with skepticism. However, I think it's tantalizing nonetheless. This was the amount of carbon emitted from the fire. 195 teragrams of carbon was emitted from the wildfire. If you do this, calculate that additional sequestration, you get approximately the same number being sequestered by that phytoplankton bloom. This fire, before you even consider carbon growback from trees or any other sort of carbon cycling enhancements, was already climate neutral, was already carbon neutral. The amount of carbon sequestered by that bloom offset the amount of carbon being emitted by the fire. If this is true, and these kind of couplings can exist, this really totally reshapes the way that we need to think about the carbon cycle, right? I mean, we just do not think about this, okay? We do not think about this in terms of the carbon cycle, these grand scale couplings across different systems in terms of the Earth system, but we absolutely should, right? But they're just not thought about. Most people, when they talk about carbon from fires, they just talk about the carbon that's emitted from a fire and then they forget about it. They don't even capture the amount of carbon in the trees when they grow back, which should, over a long enough time period, in fact, if you have the same trees growing back in the same place, be in fact the same. So this can then be carbon negative if you have those forests then growing back afterwards. Okay. The other interesting thing, of course, about this wasn't just that you had this really large enhancement here, but it was lasting for 9 months. A phytoplankton bloom hanging around for 9 months. This is way beyond the length of the fire itself. Okay. This is really, really large in terms of its persistence. There's two reasons that these authors, Weiss et al., came up with for the persistence of that. The first being that the bloom was just so large that internal recycling becomes very efficient, okay? Because the bloom can just recycle within itself. The edges of diffusion outside is less than if the bloom was smaller. The second part was taking you all the way back here to our fire and our legacy impact, in actual fact. So yes, you had the bloom being initiated by this initial combustion source here in terms of that forest being removed. But then afterwards, after removing 20% of the forest, you've got a lot of open land now. And this dust was just kept on going, just kept on kind of topping up the bloom as it was going. So again, to understand not just the magnitude, but persistence, to come back to thinking about the ways in which the Earth system is coupled, thinking about how these dust and fire systems are coupled. Only by thinking through this in a full kind of systems thinking can you get towards like an answer which then starts to make sense. Okay, so my second takeaway for you. There is a variety of responses in phytoplankton to aerosol deposition. There is plenty of evidence now that the overall that the response is likely to be positive in terms of aerosol being able to supply nutrients. However, not always, and sometimes it can in fact be toxic as well. Okay, so we've established there's a lot of different sources, a lot of different properties. There probably is a response between the phytoplankton and this aerosol deposition. So what are we doing to mess that all up in terms of the natural cycles? Okay, I love a good Venn diagram. So here we go. Here's my attempt at doing that. So we've got some big kind of human perturbations on our outside. Okay, have climate change. Humans are changing land use. Okay, we also have direct emissions of human activity, doing things like changing natural emission cycles. We're changing atmospheric chemistry. We're also changing land cover. All of this is working together to change these natural cycles of aerosol burden and their nutrient deposition. So one of the ways in which I explore this is to create models. So models are wonderful if you want to try to understand and project what might happen in the future. In fact, it's probably the only way that you can actually do it. Okay, so this is a schematic. I'm not going to go into the details of the model. If anybody's interested in modeling of iron or other species, please feel free to grab me, talk to me. I have models, I have data, I have loads of cool things that you can play with. Really happy to share this data. But in a nutshell, what I'm basically doing within the model is I'm emitting all of these different species from all these different sources into the atmosphere. They're being transported through the atmosphere. During that transport, they are actually undergoing atmospheric processing, which does increase their soluble fraction. And then we have a deposition to the ocean, and then we can run a biogeochemical model, ocean biogeochemical model, to work out what the response of changes in this deposition flux might be over time. Here, I'm just going to focus on the change from the present day to the future. I've done this for the past as well. Again, happy to talk to anybody about that might be interested in historical changes. There's three major sources that are changing over time over this century. We have industrial activity, okay, we have climate, and we have land use, land cover change, which are changing all of our emissions here. All of those things that I put together in our Venn diagram, they're all changing all of these different sources. And we look at the difference from today in terms of that deposition flux to the future once this amount of warming at the end of the century has occurred. And then we run a biogeochemical model, like I said. For this, though, I want you to keep in mind we're not changing the ocean state under climate change. Okay, the ocean state is staying the same. We're only teasing out the signal of the change in the deposition flux. Okay, so the ocean state itself is remaining fixed. That doesn't mean that there aren't compounding or, in fact, things which will go against each other. I don't know, stratification may end up being for example, aerosol ends up being more important, but we're not talking about any of that. We're just isolating the aerosol nutrient impact change here. Okay, so we can look at this under the RCP 4.5 scenario. So for anybody who doesn't know what that was, that's 4.5 watts degrees of warming. It was under the AR5, the last round of the IPCC. Okay, it's a moderate amount of warming, probably like business as usual, really, for now, in terms of the warming scenario. This is the fractional change in the amount of soluble iron to the oceans, 2100 compared to present day being 2008 here. Okay, so we can see that in general, there's a massive amount of increase in the southern oceans, not very much of a change in the northern hemisphere. Okay, that's because in the northern hemisphere, also under this scenario, the pollution from anthropogenic sources does get cleaned up, and it doesn't contain that signal that I was talking about before in terms of metals and metal smelting changes. So these two things balance each other. You have an increase in fires, you have an increase in natural emissions, but they're being balanced by this decrease as we're cleaning up the air. In the southern ocean, the southern hemisphere, you don't have that decrease in the pollution offsetting it as much, and you have massive amounts of increases in soluble iron flux, and that's basically coming from this massive increase in your natural fire and dust sources. So what does that mean in terms of our biogeochemistry? Well, here we have the end of the century change in net primary productivity, fraction of diatoms. So this is looking at community composition, and then the carbon exported. See that the numbers are slightly different here. You're looking about 80%. Here you're looking about 20%. Okay, moderate changes in primary productivity, large changes in community composition, increasing the amount of nutrients. It isn't just boosting productivity, it's also shifting potentially community composition towards larger phytoplankton. That means your carbon export is going to be more efficient. if you pay attention to here, this number here, 20%, 20%. It's what I say earlier about our extreme event. Our extreme event was creating a 20% change. By the end of the century, extreme is now just normal. Okay, so what is extreme now could potentially just be business as usual by the time we get to the end of the century due to the perturbation of those systems. So that word extreme, like I say, love-hate relationship, it's a moving target, right? So end of the century, potentially we are increasing carbon export by 20%. Okay. Interestingly, in this study as well, just another little snippet for you, we found that our two major sources to the Southern Ocean are dust versus our fire, that the fire was actually far, far, far more efficient at stimulating the biological carbon pump, maybe 9-10 times more, an order of magnitude more than the dust. Okay, so every gram of soluble iron which was deposited to the Southern Ocean, you got X amount of grams of carbon being sequestered, and that number of grams was an order of magnitude more for fire, iron fire, than it was for dust fire in terms of this modeling simulation. There it is, just cycled out for you. We've updated this recently with a new update, this time following the SSP scenarios. Okay, that stands for the socioeconomic scenarios. So this time we're also including socioeconomic choices. I don't want to spend too long on this really, because I've got a couple of other things that I want to talk about. But basically to say this is now a very low warming scenario. We're very highly unlikely to get this. Okay, this is a moderate warming scenario under SSP 370. You also have a massive population boom. Okay, population in terms of socioeconomics, it just keeps on going. We don't have any change in population. It's just kind of linear. This is a very high forcing scenario. Okay, lots and lots of warming. However, human population does actually come back at the end of the century to around about the same number as what it is today. Here, we're looking at the amount of change at the future to the present day in terms of the soluble iron deposition, okay, in terms of our maps or in terms of latitudinal averages. We have in green, this is climate-driven fires, always a positive. So climate's always going to be increasing the amount of soluble iron from fires in terms of climate. In red, this is iron from anthropogenic fires. This is things like deforestation fires, agricultural fires. So this is assuming in this scenario and this scenario here that we start to stop deforesting fires, basically. However, in the Northern Hemisphere, under these scenarios, we do keep on increasing the amount of anthropogenic fires, agricultural fire in particular. And blue is your other sources, okay, other sources of iron. We get a slightly different picture to what we saw before. Before we saw that it was the South Pacific, which was kind of being highlighted as a potential region with about plus 20%. Here, if we look across the SSP scenarios, the main thing that I really want you to take away is that that changes from the South Pacific to the North Atlantic. Same number though, about 20%. Okay, so there's some uncertainty depending on the ways that you configure these, depending on what particular emission scenarios you kind of use. But we're kind of looking in HNLC regions, either North Atlantic, South Pacific, Southern Ocean, that you're probably looking somewhere around about a 20% change in the amount of iron ore export occurring by the end of the century as a function of climate change. Okay. And then the nice thing about that particular study is because we used many models and we used different climate scenarios, is that we could tease out where our major sources of uncertainty are in terms of the differences that we were getting in terms of the soluble iron flux. And if you have a stippling here, it means the uncertainty was attributed to differences in the models. And what that means for everybody in the room, that I need to know about the processes that are happening in these regions. Okay, there's model uncertainty. That means that there's some sort of structural uncertainty in the way that we understand the ways in which these processes are happening in these regions. Basically, I think most of the Southern Ocean and some regions as well in the Atlantic. The other one, where you have the dots, the uncertainty is due to climate change. Okay, so where different amounts of warming will result in a different answer. And so for that, we need to understand more about the ways in which climate can actually change. Sometimes that's actually not going to be known to us because socioeconomical choices, of course, can change on a dime, right? You know, so some of this may be irreducible, but definitely in these places, these are places I would love people to go and learn more about processes, because it basically is highlighting we don't know enough at the moment. Okay, it's not just iron fluxes that are changing, of course. It's also nitrogen and phosphorus changes very quickly for you. This is the end of century changes in N to P ratios or Fe to P ratios. You can see that there's some spatial differences here. If you're in the purple going above 1, the system is potentially moving towards more phosphate limitation. Maybe so not just iron, we can look across different nutrients as well. But this is something I want to get to today, something that's really been on my mind in the last year or so, something I'm really moving my mind towards is phosphate and changes in phosphate, in particular, the phosphate which is coming from fertilizers. So often when we think about fertilizer phosphate, you'll think about it in terms of runoff, okay, from farms, getting into your rivers, going down to lakes, causing eutrophication, okay? We know that there's a problem if you put too much phosphate into systems. However, before that, before it's even put onto the land, there's a whole process in actually making fertilizers where we get massive rocks, we grind them down, we acidify them, we turn them into the fertilizer that you're using in your plants, that people are using in their farms. All of those processes are creating massive amounts of dust. Massive amounts of fertilizer phosphate is being released to the atmosphere. Unsurprisingly, that stuff is loved by plants. So it's probably going to be having an impact if we start shifting these cycles. And our demand for fertilizer is not going anywhere as well, okay? As population is growing, as people's diets are changing, our demand for fertilizer is growing. So here we have, on the left-hand side, we have total phosphorus. In terms of all the different sources that are supplying phosphorus to the ocean, here's fertilizer production, all these different bits, grinding, binding, all these other things. You can see in terms of the total amount, okay, maybe it's similar to the primary biogenics, PBAP, anybody doesn't know, primary biochemical particles, that's things like pollen, a little bits of like detritus and stuff like that. Dust is massively, massively dominating. However, remember, we don't care about total, okay, in terms of what we care about is the soluble fraction, the phosphate, in terms of what we're thinking in terms of biogeochemical cycles. That looks slightly different without fertilizer. Okay, now our primary biogenics are also another really important source in terms of providing fertilizer. But our fertilizer is potentially equal to dust. Okay, that's huge. That's absolutely massive in terms of the amount of phosphate which is getting into the atmosphere and getting deposited, potentially impacting aquatic cycles, not just in marine environments, but also in freshwater cycles as well. So we ran this, put it all into the model. Where is that actually having the biggest impact in terms of the deposition? This is a fractional contribution from each of these different sources which are produced in the last one, which I was showing you here. How much of that, for the fractional contribution to the total amount of deposition, pay attention to our fertilizer, really dominating the amount of phosphate being delivered to both the North Atlantic and the Mediterranean. Here we have the nice update from Browning and Twining of where different nutrients are limiting in the ocean. Surprise, surprise, where we're getting this massive signal is in fact where phosphate is in fact limiting, okay? So are we perturbing these cycles? Is fertilizer feeding the ocean? What does this mean, this fertilizer production? I don't know. It's still an open question. Really happy to talk to anyone about that. Okay, so takeaway number 3, human perturbation to cycles is also highly variable. Everything's highly variable. Okay, some of my summaries, and then I've got one little extra thing for you at the end. Sources, dust dominates iron, dust dominates phosphorus as well. However, you need to be careful, not looking just at the global budgets. Regionally, these other sources are very important. Impacts, we need to be able to connect microscale in situ experiments to mesoscale, basin scale modeling. Okay, we want to understand these kind of impacts across the basin scale, across the global scale. That requires lots of interdisciplinary collaboration, lots of bringing different people to the room, lots of different resources. Human perturbation, signal is unclear in some places. However, what's extreme now could well be business as usual at the end of the century. I am going to take a little liberty here and just finish on this one as well. Something else that I'm working on at the moment in terms of the human impact on biogeochemical cycles. There was another devastating fire at the beginning of this year, the Los Angeles urban wildfire. There was a cruise ship out in the California basin. This is meant to be just like a normal daytime. This is the pollution plume coming out from the LA. They were underneath the plume. This is the ship track. Cal Coffee just goes up and down all the time sampling. Okay, they were right underneath This is a phytoplankton tow net. Look at what came out of that. It was absolutely mocket, as we would say in Scotland. It was absolutely full of ash. Here is a transect of what they collected in terms of distance from the shore, really close to the shore, absolutely full of stuff. This is anchovy eggs, all getting mixed up with this ash, which was being deposited here. Here's another picture of that's the stuff that came out of the net. Here's the plume in terms of that fire. So it's really impacting the whole basin. What I want to say, what I really want to impress on you is that this is not a normal fire. Okay, this isn't burning down trees and burning down like grasses in terms of what I was talking about before in terms of nitrogen and phosphorus. We're talking about houses, we're talking about cars. California has the largest fraction of electric cars. What's driving those? Lithium batteries, okay? You have arsenic in the wood, in the timber, which is preserving that wood. You have asbestos, you have, let's not scare you too much, but there was a lot of stuff in there. And that's all being transported out into the ocean basin. So I really do care about that at the moment, really trying to understand what does it mean if we're starting to get fires in these kind of urban areas, as well as natural fires. There we go. This is some other research ideas, potentially. Happy to talk to anyone. Please reach out to me if there's any of these other things that you're interested in, HABs, clouds, fisheries, all these kinds of things for you. And I'll stop there. Thank you very much.